The announcement that stopped the nation. It happened at 8:06 a.m. London time. Just as the city was shaking off the last threads of a pale winter dawn, a single notification lit up the phones of millions, carrying a message no one expected and everyone feared. A statement from Catherine, Princess of Wales. The words were simple, carefully measured, music, and yet heavy enough to still the air across the United Kingdom. Following a series of specialist consultations, William and I have learned that our son, Prince Louis, has been diagnosed with a condition that requires ongoing care. We are committed to supporting him with love, stability, and the privacy he deserves. No details, no medical terminology, no reassurance wrapped in the hopeful language the palace typically relied on. Just the truth. Bare, quiet, heartbreaking truth. Within minutes, the news raced across morning broadcasts. BBC cut through its usual program with a heavy tone. Sky News anchors fell silent between sentences, searching for composure. Even American networks, barely past midnight on the East Coast, broke into scheduled segments with urgent updates. Outside Kensington Palace, people gathered instinctively as though the cold courtyard itself had called them. Some stood motionless, phones still raised, others covered their mouths. Older viewers, those who had lived through the tender, complicated eras of Charles, Diana, and the early years of William and Harry, whispered the same sentence again and again. Oh God, not the children. Music, across Britain, something unspoken settled into the winter air. An ache that no royal protocol could soften, no press strategy could dilute. Prince Louis, 5 years old, the family's mischievous spark, the child whose joyful expressions had charmed the world, was now facing a challenge his parents had fought desperately to keep private. And at the center of it all stood Catherine. Inside Kensington Palace, the atmosphere that morning was unlike anything staff had witnessed in years. The corridors, normally filled with the steady music rhythm of daily duties, felt unnervingly still. Even the long-serving attendants who had seen births, transitions, illness, and scandal moved with a gentleness that betrayed their worry. Music, the announcement had not been made lightly. For weeks, perhaps months, the decision had hung over Catherine like a winter cloud, refusing to break. She had drafted versions, revised them, torn them apart, rewritten them, then folded them away again. Each time she wrestled with the same impossible balance: protect Louis' privacy, honor the public's trust, preserve the dignity of a child living far beyond the spotlight's reach. But now, with whispers growing and inquiries tightening around unexplainable cancellations in the Wales family calendar, Catherine knew silence would no longer shield her son. William had offered to deliver the statement himself. Music refused. "This is my responsibility," she had said the night before, her voice steady but thin at the edges. "I will not let this story reach the public without hearing it from me." Those who stood beside her during that tense evening saw a woman not merely performing royal duty, but carrying the weight of motherhood in its rawest form. She had faced the country before during joyful milestones, national tragedies, demanding initiatives, but never like this. Never with her child's vulnerability pressed against her heart. The hours leading to the announcement were agonizing. Shortly after dawn, Catherine retreated to the small sitting room adjacent to her private study, a space she often used for reading, quiet reflection, or drafting letters. Today it felt like a sanctuary and a battlefield in equal measure. Her statement lay printed on the table beside her. She read it once more, silently mouthing each word, as though making sure they still aligned with the truth she felt compelled to share. A faint knock at the door. William entered quietly. He did not speak at first. Instead, he walked to her, sat beside her, and took her hands in his. "They will understand," he said softly, "and they will stand with us." But Catherine shook her head gently. "I don't fear for us," she whispered. "I fear for him." It was the only moment her composure faltered. At 7:59 a.m., the Palace Communications Office received the final approval. The statement would go live at 8:06 precisely, a time chosen not for symbolism, but to avoid competing with parliamentary coverage and international scheduling cycles. At 8:05, Catherine stood by the window overlooking the frost-covered gardens. She breathed deeply, her reflection faint in the glass. A mother first, a future queen second, a shield for her children always. At 8:06, the announcement was released, and by 8:07, the world felt different. For in that single minute, the veil between monarchy and humanity dissolved in a way that echoed the most vulnerable moments of Diana's era. A reminder that behind titles, behind ceremony, behind centuries of tradition, music lived a family bound not by myth, but by love, and now by fear. The winter had shifted, and nothing inside the Wales household would ever be the same again. Behind closed doors, the first signs something was wrong. The earliest signs were so subtle, so easily disguised beneath the natural rhythms of childhood that even those closest to the family dismissed them at music first. It was late September, a period typically marked by the steady return to school routines, official engagements, and the quiet settling of the Wales household, music, into its familiar tempo before the winter months pressed in. But something in Lewis shifted. It began with small, fleeting moments when he seemed unusually tired after play. Moments Catherine initially attributed to growth spurts and busy school days. A gentle slump on the sofa after an afternoon outdoors. A quiet withdrawal during what was normally his most energetic hour. These moments passed quickly, too quickly to raise alarm on their own. Yet, Catherine noticed them. She always noticed the little things. One evening, during a private family dinner, Louis rested his head against William's arm and stayed there longer than usual. Music. William smiled at first, brushing a hand through his son's hair. But then he exchanged a brief look with Catherine, a look that carried a ripple of worry neither said aloud. "He is just tired," William offered quietly later that night. But Catherine could not shake the unease. In early October, the first medical consultation was arranged quietly and without the palace's usual logistics. The team wanted to avoid attention, questions, or speculation. The pediatric specialist they met in London was reassuring, thorough, but non-committal. He requested more observations, additional tests, and for Catherine to monitor specific patterns over the coming weeks. Catherine left the appointment with a faint chill beneath her ribs. Not fear exactly, not yet, but something that felt like the beginning of fear. Inside Kensington Palace, staff began to sense the change even before they understood it. The atmosphere around the children's wing tightened. Senior aides were instructed to reduce Lewis's public-facing moments. Scheduled appearances involving all three Wales children were quietly adjusted or postponed. There were no press briefings, no explanations, just a subtle recalibration of visibility. Those who worked closest to Catherine could see the strain emerging behind her practiced calm. She remained warm, gracious, engaged. But there was a new layer beneath her composure, a watchfulness that made her pause during briefings, lift her head when a child coughed down the hall, or step away from meetings without explanation when her phone buzzed. Even Princess Charlotte grew slightly protective, insisting on holding Lewis's hand during walks through the garden, as though sensing the adult's unspoken worry. The turning point came in mid-October during what should have been a simple school morning. Louis hesitated at the foot of the stairs, not with reluctance or mischief, but with uncertainty. A small pause, a quiet swallow, a faint tremor in his hand. Catherine knelt beside him, her voice soft. "Are you all right, darling?" Louis nodded, but his eyes didn't. That moment, tiny, almost invisible, was the one that pierced through all her rational explanations. She kissed his forehead, sent him to school, and then retreated to her study, closing the door behind her. Music. Her private secretary entered minutes later to find her sitting at the edge of the sofa, hands clasped tightly, the morning light turning the room pale. "Please call the specialist," she said. "I want a next test moved up." From that point forward, the palace's protective shell tightened. Meetings between William and senior advisors were shifted behind completely closed doors. Catherine's early childhood engagements were rescheduled with unprecedented frequency. Staff who had served the family for years began to speak in hushed tones, careful not to speculate, but unable to ignore the gathering concern. A particularly tense moment unfolded one late afternoon at Windsor during a small family gathering attended by Anne. The children were playing in the garden when Louis briefly sat down on the cold stone steps, rubbing his arm with a fleeting expression of discomfort. And ever-perceptive, noticed immediately, Catherine met her gaze across the terrace. And for the first time, Catherine did not find a way to soften the truth. Her expression told, and everything she needed to know. Later, in a quiet corner away from the children, and placed a hand on Catherine's shoulder. A rare gesture from a woman known more for steel than softness. "You are doing everything right," Music said. "Whatever this is, you are meeting it head-on." But Catherine's voice trembled slightly when she replied, "I just want him to be all right." By early November, the palace had adopted full confidentiality protocols. Internal documents referring to the Wales children were encrypted. Scheduling changes were concealed within broader restructuring memos. Even within the family, conversations grew more cautious. Charles was informed in careful increments. Camilla was briefed separately, and only a handful of top-level aides knew the extent of the ongoing consultations. But beneath all the protocol, beneath all the protective silence, the truth was becoming unmistakable. Something was wrong, something real, something no title, no lineage, no centuries of monarchy could shield them from. And as winter approached, Catherine felt the quiet dread grow heavier. A dread she tried desperately to hold alone until the diagnosis finally came and shattered the final illusion of safety. When the diagnosis arrived that night, everything changed. The diagnosis did not arrive with drama or fanfare. It came quietly, almost too quietly for the magnitude of the truth it carried, delivered in a single envelope left on the polished table in Catherine's private sitting room at Windsor. The date was November 22nd, a cold evening when the winter wind pressed heavily against the old stone walls, and the corridors hummed with the early preparations for the holiday season. But none of that mattered. When Catherine stepped into the room and saw the envelope waiting for her, she knew instantly what it contained. For 2 days, she had been living in suspended breath, waiting for the final test results, knowing that the specialists had detected patterns that could not be ignored. She had been preparing herself for the call, for the conversation, for the moment when speculation would turn into certainty. Yet, despite her preparations, her fingers trembled slightly as she opened the envelope. The room was silent. The world, for a moment, went still. The diagnosis was written in careful language, precise and compassionate, but the meaning was unmistakable. Louis had a chronic condition, manageable but lifelong, not fatal but significant, not a temporary childhood phase, but a reality that would shape his development, require ongoing medical attention, and demand profound adjustments to the family's rhythm. It was the kind of diagnosis that lived in the delicate space between hope and fear, between relief that it was not worse and heartbreak that it was not better. Catherine sank slowly onto the sofa, holding the papers in her lap. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply breathed deep, quiet breaths as if trying to steady the ground beneath her. It was William who found her. He had just returned from a late briefing in London, his coat still dusted with the frost of the night air. At first, he smiled as he entered the room, expecting to see her reading or reviewing the next day's schedule. But when he saw the envelope on the table, the smile faded. "Is that it?" he asked softly. She handed him the papers without a word. William read slowly, methodically, the way he did when the weight of responsibility was already settling on his shoulders. His jaw tightened once, then again. He set the papers down carefully as if they were fragile. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Catherine whispered, "We can manage this." But William heard the tremor she tried to hide. He moved to sit beside her, taking her hand in both of his. "We will," he said. "We always do." Yet, even as he spoke, he felt the quiet devastation pressing against the edges of his composure. Not because of the condition itself. Conditions can be managed, but because of what it meant for their son, for his childhood, for the scrutiny that would inevitably follow once the truth became public. The monarchy does not get the luxury of private struggle. Not really, not for long. Within an hour, the palace emergency protocol was activated. Only 5 individuals were informed: the king and the private secretary, the chief medical liaison, and 1 chosen communications advisor sworn to confidentiality. Files were encrypted, Internal memos were written in euphemistic language. Meetings were rearranged to create pockets of privacy around the Wales household, and arrived at Windsor the next morning without ceremony, stepping through the side entrance reserved for the most sensitive family matters. She was briefed in a small drawing room where Catherine explained the diagnosis with clinical precision, refusing out of instinct to allow emotion to cloud her explanation. And saw the strain anyway. When Catherine finished and reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "He is strong," she said. "Stronger than he knows. And he has you." Catherine nodded, swallowing hard. "I just want him to grow without this shadow." Anne's gaze softened. "Children adapt faster than we do. It is the world that struggles, not them." Meanwhile, Charles received the news at Clarence House. He listened in silence, leaning heavily on his cane, the weight of the moment settling into the lines of his face. "My poor boy," he murmured, referring not just to Louis, but to William, music, who he knew would bear the burden of both fatherhood and duty. Camilla, though briefed separately, reacted with a rare quietness. She asked no strategic questions and offered no commentary. She simply sent a message to Catherine. "You are not alone." But despite the support, the internal pressure began to mount. Music, how long could they keep this private? How would the press react once they learned why Louis's appearances had changed? And how could Catherine continue her public role while carrying the weight of a diagnosis she had barely begun to process? As night fell again over Windsor, Catherine walked quietly into Louis's bedroom. He was fast asleep. Music, his small hand curled under his cheek, his breathing soft and steady. She sat beside him and brushed his hair back gently. In that moment, she realized something that broke her and strengthened her at the same time. This diagnosis did not change who he was. It did not take away his joy, his spirit, his laughter, but it changed everything around him. And she would have to be the one to face the world with the truth. Not tonight, not tomorrow. Music, but soon. The winter would not allow silence forever. The palace in crisis mode, preparing for an announcement. They never wanted to make the morning after the diagnosis. Windsor Castle felt unusually still, wrapped in a hush that seemed to settle into the stone itself. Staff moved carefully, speaking in softened tones, instinctively aware that something heavy had entered the atmosphere. It was not yet public. It had not yet reached the ears of the press, but everyone inside the palace ecosystem could feel the shift. Confidentiality protocols snapped instantly into place. William convened the first emergency meeting in a private conference room deep inside the Windsor complex, a room used only during moments of true institutional concern. The air was cold, the winter light was pale through the high windows, and the small group gathered around the table carried a kind of braced, music solemnity. Catherine was there, composed, but impossibly fragile beneath the practiced steadiness, and William took a seat beside her, offering an anchor-like presence. The king attended via secure link, his voice thin but controlled. 3 senior aides, including the medical liaison, joined with folders pressed tightly in their hands. William opened the meeting with no preamble. "We need to determine how to protect Louis," he said, "and how to prepare for what will inevitably follow once the public begins to ask questions." It was not a question. It was the unavoidable truth. Music, Louis's reduced appearances had already raised quiet murmurs in the press. Analysts were beginning to track patterns. Online speculation had begun forming like frost on a window pane, thin, fragile, but music growing. The medical liaison spoke first, explaining the precise nature of the diagnosis, outlining the long-term care plan, and recommending adjustments to Louis's schedule. Music, his voice was calm, but the weight of his words filled the room. He will need ongoing monitoring. He may have periods of increased fatigue. Stress could aggravate symptoms, so public events must be handled carefully. Catherine lowered her eyes, absorbing every word, and spoke next, her tone sharper than anyone else's in the room. "We must prepare for narratives to spin beyond our control. There needs to be a plan for when, not if, the press notices." King Charles exhaled audibly through the secure speaker system. "The family must be united in its response," he said. "This cannot become another storm of speculation." Camilla, who joined from Clarence House, added gently, "People will have compassion if we guide the message with care, but silence can only hold for so long." Silence. It had become both their shield and their burden. By midday, the crisis team had drafted initial frameworks for 3 potential announcements. All were bluntly labeled with internal codes. The first option, a preemptive release, providing the diagnosis early in controlled language. The second, a partial disclosure, revealing only that Lewis had a health challenge requiring adjustments to his schedule. The third, complete confidentiality, withholding all details until circumstances forced transparency. Catherine stared at the options, her breath tightening. She hated the word disclosure. It felt clinical, detached, as though the palace were discussing a public initiative rather than her child's reality. She finally spoke, her voice soft but unwavering. "I want him protected from scrutiny for as long as possible. He is so young. He deserves that." William nodded, but the conflict was visible in the tension around his eyes. "Every day we delay," one communications advisor cautioned, "speculation will grow, and speculation uncontrolled is far more damaging than truth." And bristled slightly. "We do not answer to the tabloids. We answer to duty and to this family." But the tension remained. When the meeting adjourned, Catherine retreated to her private garden terrace where the winter air stung against her skin. She wrapped her coat tighter, staring at the frost-covered hedges as staff moved discreetly across the grounds. William joined her silently. "Are you all right?" he asked. She shook her head before she could stop herself. "I keep thinking, did I miss something earlier? Could we have caught it sooner?" Her voice cracked, though she fought to contain it. William placed a hand gently against her cheek. "This is not your fault. You did everything right. You always do." But self-blame had already seeped in, as it does with every parent receiving news they never expected to face. Catherine felt its weight pressing down on her chest. Later that afternoon, Charles summoned Anne and William to a secure conversation. Music, his voice, though steady, carried the exhaustion of a man who had lived through too many family crises, music to count. "We must avoid another spiral like the one with Harry and Meghan," he said bluntly. "If this becomes an international talking point before we are ready, the reaction will be brutal." Anne's expression hardened. "Music, this is not a scandal. This is a child's health. The press must show restraint." "Must," Charles repeated quietly. "But I doubt they will." Meanwhile, the palace started preparing contingency plans for school adjustments, for public engagements, for increased security at medical facilities. Even the Wales family's holiday plans were quietly rewritten to reduce exposure. Music. Staff described the atmosphere as winter pressure, the kind of tension that builds silently until it fills every corridor. Catherine, however, bore the heaviest unseen burden. She still had to attend certain engagements, smile for photographers, move gracefully between charity events, speak about early childhood development while privately carrying the knowledge that her own child needed support. She had not yet fully learned how to provide. Music. Each time she looked at a camera, she wondered if people could see the worry behind her eyes. Each time she held Lewis's hand, she wondered if she was holding too tightly. And each night, as the palace fell quiet, she lay awake, replaying every small moment from the past year, seeking signs she should have seen sooner. By the end of November, the palace's internal machinery was fully engaged, and the question haunting every corridor was no longer, "What is happening to Louis?" but rather, "When will the world find out?" Music. And how do we prepare for the storm that will follow? When the leak emerged, the secret could no longer hold. The leak did not come from a tabloid, nor from a rogue staff member seeking attention. It came, as so many palace crises do, from a place no one initially suspected, the quiet outer ring of the medical network. A small routine administrative request misfiled, misrouted, music and briefly visible where it should not have been set the entire royal household on edge. It was November 29th, just after dawn, when a senior communications aide rushed into Windsor with a printout clutched in shaking hands. Music. Catherine had barely finished her morning tea when the knock sounded firm, urgent, unmistakable. "Ma'am," the aide said, breathing hard. "We have a situation." William was summoned immediately. Within minutes, the three of them sat inside Catherine's study as the aide explained how a single line referencing Lewis's ongoing medical evaluations had appeared in an internal report at a hospital where a junior clerk noticed the name attached to a royal code. There was no diagnosis listed, thank heaven, but there was enough phrasing to suggest that a senior royal child was under medical review. A harmless administrative accident under normal circumstances, but not when the name attached was Louis, and not when the world had already begun whispering. William leaned forward, elbows on knees, absorbing the details. "Has it left the system?" he asked. "We don't believe so," the aide replied, though the tremor in his voice suggested fear rather than certainty. But a staff member in the billing department flagged the note to a supervisor, and that supervisor made a comment we consider concerning. "Music? What kind of comment?" William pressed. The aide swallowed. She said, "If the press knew this, they'd go mad. And we do not yet know how many people heard her." Catherine felt her heartbeat tighten. The walls around her seemed to shift as though the room itself had tilted. "Music, so it begins," she whispered. For months she had dreaded the moment when private suffering risked becoming public speculation. A child's health transformed into chatter, commentary, analysis, music noise. She closed her eyes, steadying herself against the rising panic. William reached for her hand, squeezing gently. "We'll get ahead of it," he said. "We won't let them define this." But even as he spoke, the palace machinery roared into motion. By 9 a.m., an emergency call was held with senior palace communications, legal advisors, and the king's team. Charles, though fatigued, insisted on being part of every conversation. His voice was low, gravelly but resolute. "We must contain this," he said. "Music, if a whisper escapes to the press, they will feast on it." And joined a moment later, her presence instantly changing the tone of the call. She listened to the details in silence, jaw tightening, eyes narrowing. "This is the problem with a modern monarchy," she said finally. "Too many people, too many systems. Privacy has become a myth." Camilla, dialing in from Clarence's house, added softly, "We cannot panic, but neither can we pretend this is small. If the leak spreads internally, it is only a matter of time before the media starts asking questions." By noon, the palace had requested discreet cooperation from the hospital's administration. Files were locked. Access logs were reviewed. Staff were asked in carefully framed language to treat the matter with utmost confidentiality. But the palace had learned from experience that damage rarely announces itself. Music, it creeps. And by that evening, an editor at one of Britain's more aggressive tabloids contacted a low-level palace press officer with a seemingly innocent question. "Is everything all right with the youngest Wales child? We're hearing chatter from inside medical circles." That was the moment the palace's quiet concern turned into active alarm. Inside Windsor, William and Catherine stood together near the tall windows of the private drawing room, the winter sky sinking in a deep blue beyond them. "They know something," William said, the words cutting through the stillness like a blade. Catherine wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the cold seep into her bones. "What are we going to do?" she asked. William hesitated just for a heartbeat before responding. "We tell the truth," he said, "but only the part that belongs to us, not the part that belongs to him." He meant Louis. He meant protecting the small, gentle boy with the bright laugh and the brave little smile. But the truth was becoming harder to shield. For the next 2 days, the palace operated like a fortress under siege. Internal communications were rerouted through secure channels. Staff were instructed to deny all health-related inquiries. Every conversation carried an undercurrent of urgency. The press officer who received the initial inquiry was coached carefully on how to respond. "No, we have no comment on private, music family matters. No, there is no announcement at this time. No, we will not be engaging further." But the editor's follow-up email arriving late that night sent a final jolt through the household. "We understand Prince Louis has undergone recent evaluations. We intend to publish if clarification is not provided." The words hung in the air like a threat. By midnight, William and Catherine were meeting with advisors again. Exhaustion clung to them both, but neither wavered. "We cannot let them force our hand," Catherine said. "We cannot let this become a frenzy. "We won't," William replied. "But we also cannot lie." He paused, looking at the table where the envelope with the diagnosis still lay, evidence of the fragile truth they were trying to protect. "When the moment comes," he said quietly, "we speak. Not because we want to, but because we have no choice." Catherine nodded slowly. She knew the moment was close. She could feel it tightening around them. The leak had not yet reached the world, but it had reached the palace, and that alone changed everything. When Catherine finally spoke, a mother's truth unveiled. The morning Catherine chose to speak was not dramatic, not storm-stained or chaotic. It was quiet. A cold, pale December light had just begun to spread across Windsor when she woke before everyone else. Sitting for a long time at the edge of the bed with her hands folded, breathing slowly, as though preparing to walk into a headwind she had spent weeks trying to avoid. Down the hallway, the house was still. Even the staff moved softer than usual, aware that the palace was holding its breath. Music for days. The pressure had mounted. The inquiry from the tabloid, the whispered questions from foreign correspondents, the tightening ring of speculation surrounding a child who had never asked for the spotlight. And yet, Catherine's decision had not been forced. Not entirely. It had crystallized slowly, painfully, through a series of moments only a mother could understand. The night before, Louis had woken from a restless sleep, asking if he still had to go back to the place with the loud machines. William had knelt beside him, smoothing his hair gently, promising that everything would be all right. Catherine had stood in the doorway, watching her husband, steady music but strained, her son brave but frightened. And in that moment, she knew she could not allow rumors, leaks, music, or strangers to control the story of her child's life. If a truth had to be told, it would be told by her. By 7 a.m., she was dressed, hair pulled back, face composed not with royal poise, but with something deeper, maternal, music resolve. William joined her in the small private sitting room overlooking the gardens. He didn't ask if she was sure. He didn't need to. The certainty was written across her expression. The palace had prepared several draft statements overnight, long, cautious documents full of institutional language. But Catherine pushed them aside and slid a handwritten page across the table. "This," she said, "is the only version that matters." William picked it up. The script was neat, steady, unmistakably hers. It didn't reveal details, only what the world had begun to sense. Music. Their youngest child was undergoing medical evaluation. The process was ongoing. They were hopeful. They were grateful. They were asking for privacy. No dates, no specifics. Music, just the truth, shaped with care. William read the statement twice before placing it down. "It's music honest," he said softly. "And it protects him. That's all I want," Catherine whispered. Music. At 8:15, Princess Anne arrived without ceremony, coat still dusted with frost. She had driven from Gatcombe the moment she heard Catherine was preparing to speak. When she entered the room, she didn't offer platitudes. She simply placed a firm hand on Catherine's shoulder. "He will be all right," she said, "and this is the dignified way to do it." And, who rarely affirmed emotional decisions, had said enough. Shortly after, King Charles, moving slower than usual but determined, joined them via secure call. His face appeared slightly blurred through the screen, the winter light behind him casting long shadows across his study. "My dear girl," he said gently, "I am proud of you, though I wish with all my heart you didn't have to bear this." Music. Catherine felt tears threaten, but blinked them away. "We'll manage," she assured him. "Louis is strong. Music, we all are." Camilla's voice chimed in briefly, steady, unexpectedly warm. "You are doing what any mother would do, and you are doing it with grace." By 9 a.m., the final wording was approved unchanged from Catherine's handwritten draft, except for minor punctuation adjustments. Kensington Palace prepared to release the statement across official channels. But before they did, Catherine asked for a moment alone with William. They stood together near the tall French doors. Music, watching the gardens outside shimmer under a blanket of frost. Louis was somewhere upstairs laughing with his siblings, unaware of the storm gathering around him. "You know it won't be kind," William said quietly. "The world never is." "I know," Catherine whispered. "But we'll face it together, and truth is easier to bear than rumor." At 9:30, the statement went out. Within minutes, the world stopped. Newsrooms froze mid-sentence. Analysts scrambled. Social media erupted in disbelief, music, and sorrow. The calm, measured tone of the announcement only amplified its weight. Music. Catherine, Princess of Wales, had confirmed that young Prince Louis was undergoing medical evaluation. It was heartbreaking. Music. It was human. It was real. Inside Windsor, the family gathered in a small circle. William, Catherine, George, Charlotte, and Louis, now tugging at his mother's sleeve, asking why so many people suddenly cared about him. Music. Catherine knelt, pulled him close, and whispered the same truth she had whispered to herself for weeks. "Because you are loved." And in that moment, despite the chaos unfolding beyond the palace walls, something fragile yet powerful settled around them. A sense of unity, of purpose. Music of strength born not from crowns or titles, but from the fierce and unwavering love of a family protecting its own. And as the world absorbed Catherine's quiet truth, the palace stood suspended between heartbreak and hope. Louis's diagnosis reshaped not only a winter season, but the future of a family already carrying too much. Yet through fear and speculation, one certainty remained. The Wales family would face this storm together.